Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles, and I thought it was high time, with the assistance of Flambas, I'll take a look at the first Dutch ship to be introduced into World of Warships. The 1950s design anti-submarine destroyer HNLMS Friesland. One particularly amusing thing that I noticed when researching the history of these vessels was that they were designed by a Dutch engineer who went by the name of K. de Munter, which I thought was hilarious because in Royal Navy slang, a munter is a particularly unattractive breed of woman. So I liked that. Another interesting thing to note about the Friesland class of submarine hunters was that their main machinery, the engines, the generators, they were all direct copies of those built and used on the American Gearing class destroyers. They were in fact license-built copies, but similarities end there. The armament of the Friesland was substantially different. At the front there, just behind the forward gun turret, you can see a bunch of anti-submarine rocket launchers, which for now, of course, are completely cosmetic and serve no actual purpose in the game, although when submarines get introduced into the game, perhaps later on this year, perhaps early next year, well, they're going to be something to keep an eye on. But this ship has no torpedoes. It's the first destroyer introduced to the game that is completely bereft of torpedo armament. This was not unusual for surface warships designed from the 1950s onwards. In fact, if you have a look at HMS Belfast on the River Thames, post-war refits saw that ship stripped of its torpedo armament and replaced with more anti-aircraft guns. Speaking of guns, if this ship doesn't have torpedoes, it's got a lot of guns, right? No, it doesn't. Well, they're very big guns. No, they're only 120mm. And it only has 4 of them. In exactly 2 turrets. So if you lose a turret, although the turrets do appear to be quite tough, but if you lose 1 turret, this ship has lost 50% of its firepower. Well, how the hell can that be competitive? Well, that's down to the rate of fire of these 120mm guns, which, as you're about to see, because Flambas has been spotted, and you can routinely count on being outspotted by anything that isn't Russian. The Friesland's stealth isn't great, but its firepower, despite being limited to only 4 120mm guns, the rate of fire of these guns is absolutely off the charts. The base reload of these 120mm, before you start messing around with captain skills and equipment, is 1.8 seconds. Yeah. And because they're 120mm guns, the high explosive shells will penetrate up to 19mm of plating, without the benefit of the IFHE skill, which means they're entirely capable of dealing with any destroyer that they're going to face, except for the Khabarovsk, obviously. And, well, the Gearing has that troll 21mm of side plating as well. But aside from the Khabarovsk, and in most circumstances the Gearing, entirely capable of dealing with any destroyer that they're going to face. This is not a destroyer like the British Jutland at tier 9 and Daring at tier 10, which require you to be either exceptionally good at World of Warships and know exactly when and how to use the armour-piercing shells on their 113mm guns, or take the IFHE skill to even be able to damage same tier destroyers with your high explosive shells. However, even without a captain possessing the IFHE skill, the Jutland and the Daring can still damage everything that they're going to face because they have torpedoes. The Friesland does not have the benefit of that kind of safety blanket, and everything that it's going to do, it's going to have to do with its guns. And without IFHE, they only have 19mm of penetration, so what exactly does that mean? Well, it means that they can deal with just about every destroyer that they're ever going to face. 19mm of high explosive penetration is also more than sufficient to deal with the bow, stern, deck and superstructure of any tier 7 cruiser that isn't the Miyoko, or the Dragon series of premium tier 7 cruisers, which have 32mm of deck plating midships. But that's it. Tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers tend to have either 25, unless they're British light cruisers of course, 25 or 27mm of bow, stern and deck plating, which the Friesland cannot penetrate with high explosive. And you can just forget it when it comes to battleships. Even Tier 7 battleships have 27mm of plating. So without the IFHE skill, the Friesland can still be effective against the overwhelming majority of destroyers that it's going to face, with only really the Khabarovsk being a tricky target. It can damage any Tier 7 cruiser that it's going to face, with the exception of the Miyoko and the Dragon series of premium cruisers, where it cannot penetrate the midship's deck plating. It cannot damage Tier 8, 9 or 10 cruisers that aren't British anywhere but in the superstructure, and it cannot damage battleships of any tier, even Tier 7, unless it hits them in the superstructure. So what are the benefits of taking the IFHE skill, and should you do it, assuming you have the points to spare? Well, that extra 30% of high explosive penetration brings you up to 25mm, and that's a fairly significant breakpoint. It does mean that you can finally damage Tier 7 battleships in the bows and the stern, and in many cases through the deck as well. But it doesn't help you at all when it comes to Tier 8, 9 or 10 battleships that you can still only damage in the superstructure, and the superstructure is likely to become damage saturated fairly quickly. It does, however, help you do significant damage to most Tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers, which have 25mm of plating typically, and this you can damage, although you're still going to get caught out when you're shooting at ships like, for example, the Des Moines, which has 27mm of plating, and as far as you're concerned, may as well be a Tier 10 battleship. But that still leaves a whole bunch of targets that you can't actually physically damage with the high explosive unless you hit them in the superstructure. Cruisers with 27mm of plating and all Tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships. Hell, even some of the carriers with their armoured decks are functionally immune to damage from the Friesland's 120mm guns. So while you could technically argue the case that unlike the British Jutland and Daring at Tier 9 and 10, which absolutely definitely require the IFHE skill in order to even be competitive, you could argue the case that the Friesland doesn't really need it. I mean, it's still competitive against every, or almost every, destroyer that it's going to face without it. And taking IFHE isn't going to help you deal with Tier 8, 9 or 10 battleships. But it will make you significantly better at being able to deal with the overwhelming majority of the cruisers that you're going to face. So I suppose the question is, which skill should you pick first when you get your Tier 10 captain on the Friesland? Should it be Concealment Expert, or should it be IFHE? Because you're really going to need both. The Friesland stealth is not fantastic. 6.4 kilometers, even with the benefit of Concealment Expert on the captain and the concealment mod on the ship itself. And that's pretty bad. I mean, it sounds pretty good, but it isn't. In fact, the only thing that the Friesland is going to outspot, so Flambas neatly fits himself between the tracks of two torpedoes there, but the only thing the Friesland is going to outspot are French or Russian destroyers. Everything else comfortably beats it as far as stealth is concerned. That Richelieu would be dead by now if Flambas was in any other destroyer, and possibly the Yoshino behind him too, because Flambas would have just torpedoed them. I suppose there is a spot of good news there, of course. Rejoice, battleship captains. If there's a Friesland on the enemy team, you no longer have to be quite as cautious when it comes to approaching angry smokescreens. Just be sure you know exactly which destroyer is inside the smokescreen, because if it's not the Friesland, oh dear. Ironically, we've seen countless examples of other destroyers, in fact other cruisers, in exactly this situation, parked right here behind this rock, just daring enemy battleships and cruisers to come around and fight them, and then eating a whole bunch of torpedoes in the face. And of course, Flambas cannot do that. He has to kill everything with his guns, and he has just killed the Kagero with his guns, but well, that wasn't exactly difficult. It's not often people lose gunfights to Kageros. Here comes the Richelieu. Now, I hope the Richelieu herpaderped around the corner like that because he knew that he didn't have to worry about torpedoes from the Friesland. Not that it did him any good, because he did broadside the friendly Jean Bart, although the friendly Jean Bart is shortly going to be laughing on the other side of his face as he runs into the torpedoes launched by the Kagero. So that's not a bad trade for the Kagero. I mean, one Tier 7 destroyer for a Tier 9 battleship. And judging by the short but brutal fusillade of fire that was coming from the island over there, I think we've just determined the location of the enemy Harugumo. Although thanks to the Friesland smokescreen, which to all intents and purposes is American and lasts forever, the Harugumo is not something that Flambass is going to have to worry about for the immediate future. It's at this point, however, that I think it's fairly safe to say that Flambass was suffering from a little bit of target fixation, because the Buffaloes managed to sneak up on him out of nowhere, and I don't care how good your smokescreen is, it ain't going to save you from a radar cruiser. And it's at this point that Flambass is really wishing he was somewhere else. Unfortunately, the Friesland isn't particularly fast. In fact, with a top speed of 36 knots by Tier 9 destroyer standards, it's actually pretty slow. To make matters worse, the Buffalo is one of those pesky cruisers that happens to have 27mm of armour plating, so the only place Flambass can damage it with his guns is in the superstructure. And yet, for some bizarre reason, the Buffalo isn't using his radar. Can Flambass get around the side of this island? Please, somebody, thank you, kill the Yoshino before he gets spotted by the Buffalo. Yes, he can. That was damn lucky. You'll notice that Flambass has switched to armour-piercing ammunition. Now, I know I've made a big song and dance about the limitations of the high explosive shells with or without the IFHE skill on this ship, but the armour-piercing at this kind of range and against that kind of broadside target is absolutely lethal. Look at this. Look at the damage. Don't know what the Buffalo was thinking, but hey, whatever. We don't question it, we're just grateful. But he is still spotted, and that can only mean the Harugumo. And I've got no doubt that this was another brown trouser moment for Flambass until he realised how little health the Harugumo was on. And it is a shame that he initially had the armour-piercing loaded after finishing off the Buffalo, because, I mean, now he's switched to the high explosive, and he had scored a couple of hits, but I think that if he'd had the HE loaded right from the start, the Harugumo would be dead. But instead, and he's probably got less than 100 health left, he has escaped into the smoke. On the bright side, Flambass managed to avoid all of his torpedoes. The Friesland has a bit of a reputation as a destroyer hunter. But it's here where the relatively pedestrian speed of only 36 knots is proving to be a bit of a problem. I mean, the Harugumo is known for being a slow Tier 10 destroyer, with a top speed of only 35.7 knots, and that is slow, but the Harugumo gets something that the Friesland doesn't. It gets an engine boost. Flambass hoping that he can make it through this smokescreen and reacquire that Harugumo before he slips out of detection range. And the Harugumo does have superior concealment to the Friesland. Most destroyers have superior concealment to the Friesland. Most destroyers that aren't Russian or French. So, is Flambass able to make it through the smokescreen and reacquire the Harugumo in time? And he is. And he's only just made it. But he's managed to take the Harugumo out. So, to answer the question that I posed earlier before things got very interesting, stealth or IFHE? You've just acquired a 10-point captain on your Friesland. Which skill should you go for first? Most of the time the answer is fairly straightforward. If you were in a Jutland or a Daring, for example, you'd absolutely take IFHE before you took Concealment Expert, because those two destroyers with their 113mm guns are all but incapable of damaging anything without IFHE. They don't have the German quarter caliber penetration, and they don't have the band-aid that was applied to the Japanese 100mm gun arm destroyers. It's not quite that cut and dried on the Friesland, however. I mean, the stealth is bad, so you want Concealment Expert. In fact, without Concealment Expert, this thing has a surface detection range with the concealment module and with a camo skin of 7.1 kilometers, which is absolutely terrible. But there's still a compelling argument to be made for taking IFHE first anyway. And that's because of the range that you can get on the Friesland's guns. If you take a captain with the advanced firing training skill, these guns will fire out to a range of 14.8 kilometers. And then if you were to also fit the main battery mod 3 upgrade, you could extend that firing range to 17.2 kilometers on a destroyer. that outshoots a lot of the cruisers that you're going to face. So it doesn't really matter if they can see you if you're outside of their shooting range. And at that kind of range, even though you can only do 36 knots, it's relatively easy to avoid incoming fire. So there's a compelling argument to be made for the argument that, well, your concealment's pretty shit in the first place. You're not really likely to be challenging most other destroyers for caps anyway. So take the IFHE skill first, take the range upgrades, and then use that to farm the 4 extra skill points that you're going to need to get Concealment Expert to make yourself at least mildly competitive against other destroyers when it comes to contesting cap circles. Of course, none of this is going to make you particularly popular with your team, who are just going to see you as another selfish destroyer captain like the Khabarovsks of this world, who just kind of cruise around the midline shooting stuff up and never challenge the capture points. However, while this is also likely to make you a fairly large and obvious target for the enemy aircraft carrier if you find yourself in a battle with one, you're going to find that the Friesland has a surprisingly potent AA defense, with an AA rating of 83 and access to the defensive fire consumable. This ship works really well as a battleship escort, which, let's not forget, is one of the things that destroyers were supposed to be for. Overall, I'd have to say I do like the Friesland, although it is certainly not without its limitations, but I think it brings a fairly unique playstyle to destroyers in World of Warships. There are certain things that it does do very well. It's pretty good at dealing with other destroyers, for example, but its limitations are significant, which means this ship is not going to be for everybody. And I'm not talking about the poor stealth, which is an issue, but right now isn't really that much of a problem for Flambas, because the enemy team don't have any surviving destroyers. So he should certainly be able to sneak this cap from the enemy team without being detected, providing he stays away from the Dmitry Donskoy, which is a radar cruiser. Now, the two limitations of the Friesland that are going to bite him in the arse in this match are the fact that he doesn't have any torpedoes, and the subpar performance of his 120mm high explosive shells, even with the IFHE skill when it comes to tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships, like the Frederick the Great, who he can only damage in the superstructure, and maybe set some fires. Which he was lucky enough to do before having to silence his guns so that he didn't get spotted by the Frederick the Great as it rounded the corner of the island there. Something that the Harugamo should have done, but didn't, and now finds himself sitting inside secondary gun battery range of a German battleship with less than 2,000 health to his name. So that ended fairly predictably. And now Flambas is in all kinds of trouble, because he's facing not one, but 2 battleships. 2 ships that he cannot damage unless he hits them in the superstructure, which is quickly going to become damage saturated, or he sets some fires. And the enemy team still have a radar cruiser, which is going to make life extremely interesting for him if he's going to flip any more of the caps, which is what, well, the only thing that he can realistically do now in order to win this match. And since the enemy team have just sunk his Bismarck, well, he no longer even has the time to do that. Admittedly, this was always going to be a tough match to win, but if he'd had some torpedoes, he could have sunk the Frederick the Great, and that would have at least bought him the time to maybe flip at least one of the caps, and possibly clinch a win for the team before the battle timer expired. But he didn't have any torpedoes, he couldn't sink the Frederick the Great, and despite doing nearly 200,000 damage in a tier 10 battle, and it just wasn't enough. Although it might have been enough if the Harugamo hadn't suicided in front of the Frederick the Great in the dying minutes, in fact seconds of the battle. But that's the Friesland for you. It's a good ship, but it definitely has some limitations, which you need to be aware of if you're thinking about getting it. And hopefully today's video, courtesy of Flambas, has shown you both the good points and the bad points to help you make that decision. Although possibly you're Dutch, you're just desperate to reenact Admiral Carol Durman's ill-fated Battle of the Java Sea in World War II, and you're going to get the thing anyway, regardless of what I or anybody else says. But for everybody else, I hope that today's video has been useful. The Friesland, available in the premium shop or in-game for 1 million free experience. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.